became allergic to penicillin because of that. Anybody in here allergic to penicillin? Now what happens if you get another shot in the rear end of penicillin? Major hives. What about you?
Same.
Yeah, my point, yes, what's you?
My mom is allergic to penicillin. Look, and they gave it to her. And all of the skin peeled off of her hand.
Yeah, it's bad. I've been allergic to penicillin since I was about 12 because that was the thing. Whenever my mom was a little bit of a hypochondriac, very nice lady, but I was an only child. She worried about me. Every time I got a sniffle, I went to the doctor. Every time I went to the doctor, gave me a shot in the butt of penicillin. Every time. By the time I was 12, I had an allergic reaction to penicillin, and if penicillin would penetrate my body at this point, it would probably close me down and it would kill me. So it's really a tough thing. If you're allergic to penicillin, it's very important that you let people know that. Okay? But it was a wonder drug and still used today. Amoxicillin is a drug used today that I can actually take that's a synthetic alternative to penicillin for, nasal infections, colds, etc. So there's a lot of people in this country that are allergic to penicillin because of the major doses they were given during the time from about 1920 to 1970. Another deadly disease that was brought under control, not cured, but brought under control in the 1920s was tuberculosis and also smallpox. Were two deadly diseases that were brought under control during the 1920s. Not cured, but under control. Who's the most famous person you know that had TB or tuberculosis? That's an American icon.
Doc Holliday, president.
He did.
Yeah.
Doc Holliday did. Franklin Roosevelt did also. But good, Doc Holliday did also. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, he did, that's right, died of it. So, in the 1920s, deadly diseases such as tuberculosis and smallpox were also brought under control. Now, here's an interesting statistic you need to know. Prior to the 1920s, the life expectancy of an American was 49 years of age. 49. After the 1920s, because of the technological changes in medicine, that number rose to 59. 10 years, the life expectancy went up after the 1920s and the advances made in medicine. But you think about that. Life expectancy 49, I'd have took a dirt nap about 9 years ago. That's scary to think. You know what I mean? Life expectancy, as long as you're going to live. I don't know what the life expectancy is now. Maybe we'll look it up. But I'll bet it's got to be in the 70s, right?
It's 77.
77? So we've come a long ways from there also. All right, let's talk about the jazz age. The jazz age. How many guys in here in jazz band? Nobody? Okay. Jazz choir? Okay. Okay, the American sound in the 1920s, that was known as the jazz age. And we'll talk a little bit. I don't profess to know everything about jazz, so you folks that are in this business might know more than me. I'm just going to give you some general information. But let's see what you know, first of all. Now, does anybody know where jazz was born? Where, specifically? New Orleans. There you go. New Orleans, Louisiana. And of all the music that poured from radio stations in the 1920s, none was more typical than jazz. It was born in the South, notably New Orleans. And jazz music blended three things together. Now let's see if you jazz people know this. Okay, jazz music blended three things. Anybody know any of them? You jazz people? What? Shh. Anybody know? First thing it blended together was West African rhythm. West African rhythm. Think of slavery. What else blended into jazz? Black work songs. Songs that the black slaves sang to entertain themselves in that miserable life we know as slavery. So, born in the South, notably New Orleans, jazz music blended three things together. West African rhythm, black work songs, and European harmony. European harmony. So that's what jazz is. It's a blend of West African rhythm, black work songs, European harmonies. That's what it started with. I'm sure it's changed over the years, but that was the start. So most of the first great jazz musicians were of what descent? African American. I'm going to give you 3 examples that are on your ID sheet of what they did. So your most successful jazz musicians in the 20s were of African American descent. That didn't mean every jazz person was black, but they were a majority. One of the more famous jazz composers of all time was Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton. Where do you think he got that nickname? He was a little bit roly-poly, but he was a great composer of jazz music. Jelly Roll Morton. Another famous jazz musician of African American descent in the 1920s was Bessie Smith. She was a female jazz singer, and probably one that you would maybe sound more familiar was Louis Armstrong, who was both a jazz singer and a tremendous jazz trumpet player. So, the first great jazz musicians were of African American descent. Some examples: Jelly Roll Morton, a jazz composer; Bessie Smith, a female jazz singer; and Louis Armstrong, who was a jazz singer and trumpet player. Now, like I mentioned, jazz music wasn't only for African Americans. In 1917, before the 20s, the original Dixieland Jazz Band became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings. That happened in 1917. So in 1917, the original Dixieland Jazz Band became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings. Became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings. Now, so where did jazz start? In the south of New Orleans. And it spread to 2 bigger city areas. One in particular became pretty big. Anybody know the 2 big cities of notability that it spread to? From New Orleans to, let's see, here's the map. Here's New Orleans. Okay, New York and Chicago. Okay, but more notably New York. So jazz music spread from New Orleans to Chicago and to New York City. A specific area in New York City known as Harlem. Very good, Harlem. Okay, so jazz music spread from New Orleans to big cities, 2 notable cities. One was Chicago, the other was New York City, especially into an area known as Harlem. And in Harlem, they had the best or most well-known nightclub in the world called the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club. Now, question to you. Anybody ever watched the movie? It's kind of an interesting movie called Life. And it's got Eddie Murphy and, what's the other guy's name? Anyway, there are 2 guys that went down to run some rum during Prohibition, got set up for the murder of a guy and spent life in prison. And when they were in prison, they were dreaming of starting their own club like the Cotton Club called the Boom Boom Club. You ever seen that movie? It's a pretty good movie. If you get a chance, you're bored, get on Netflix and watch Life. I think you'd enjoy it. Martin Lawrence and Eddie Murphy star in this movie. They're rum runners. They take some whiskey down south. Some guy gets murdered. They get blamed for it. They spend their life in prison. And they dream about someday owning their own jazz club called the Boom Boom Club, which was supposed to be better than the Cotton Club. Well, probably the most famous jazz musician to perform at the Cotton Club on a consistent basis was the great jazz musician Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington. A lot of people performed there, and it was a big deal to perform there, but the guy that was probably the most famous that was there on a consistent basis was a great jazz musician by the name of Duke Ellington. Okay? Well, that'll move us to movies in the 20s. We'll tell you a little bit about these movies in the 20s. A little bit about these movies in the 20s. Now, in the 1920s, the motion picture, that's what they actually called it, was the motion picture, became very popular. And after World War I, a suburb of Los Angeles, California, emerged as the movie capital of the world, which was what? Hollywood. Okay? So after World War I, a suburb of Los Angeles, California, emerged as the movie capital of the world, and it was called Hollywood. Now, as I kind of mentioned to you before briefly, until 1927, all movies were silent. In other words, the audience read the words on the screen to follow the plot of the movie. So somebody would be talking and then up would come the words. And that stayed that way until 1927. And until 1927, the actors that were in these movies really weren't identified. Like you see the credits now. But soon, people that produce movies began to believe that, geez, that Megan Molitor is getting kind of famous. People are asking to see her in more movies. So it was after these screen producers realized that people had their favorite actors and actresses, did they start to identify who they were with credits. Now it's kind of weird. When do credits come up now in a movie? And when they first started doing credits, they actually introduced the movie and did the credits first, and then you watch the movie. Okay? Now, if you ever watch these old sitcoms and stuff, or if you ever watch Bonanza, if you watch Bonanza, they tell you who these people are before the episode starts. It was only in the 70s and after that that your credits started coming kind of at the end. Yeah, sure, they do as they come up, you know, Tom Hanks. Well, yeah, you're right, but the credits are at the end. They used to be at the start. But they didn't even have credits until they figured out, you know, people are starting to like some of these actors and actresses. Now, with the fact that people were picking their favorites and they were buying tickets to come and see certain actors, the age of the movie star in America emerged. People became movie stars. Without this happening, Tom Hanks would be nothing. You wouldn't even know who he was. Now I'm going to give you about 7 famous actors, and then we'll be done for the day. Okay, they're all on your sheet. You can do however you want. Some famous actresses of the 1920s included Clara Bow, John Barrymore. Does that ring a bell? That's Drew Barrymore's grandfather, or maybe even great-grandfather. Probably great-grandfather, yes. John Barrymore. Charlie Chaplin. Have you heard of Charlie Chaplin? Lillian Gish. She was the, like, hot number. And Joseph Kennedy Sr. also had a little go with her. So his sons earned it pretty from experience. So Lillian Gish. Gloria Swanson, also a beautiful actress of the time that Mr. Kennedy spent some time with. Greta Garbo. And Douglas Fairbanks. These were very, very famous actors and actresses in the 1920s that set the stage for Tom Hanks that we see today, or the Kevin Costner that we see today. These guys paved the way. Clara Bow, John Barrymore, Charlie Chaplin, Lillian Gish, Gloria Swanson, Greta Garbo, Douglas Fairbanks. Now, what do you always look for? You look for a star couple. You know, the ones that always star together. And boy, they really made some money on those people. They made some money. The star couple in the 1920s was John Barrymore and Lillian Gish. When they were in a movie, you could count on people going in a big profit at the box office. John Barrymore and Lillian Gish were kind of the star couple of the time. Now, what else came out of, besides movie stars that were kind of in the same boat? And now we have late shows and all those things. Talk shows, and what do they often bring to those? Or what would you consider Jay Leno? He's a talk show host, but he's also a comedian. So comedians started coming out in the 1920s as well, and 2 of the very first famous comedians during the 1920s were Laurel and Hardy. Anybody ever heard of them? You know, anybody know what their appearance was like? They worked together as comedians on stage. One was very, very skinny, and one was very, very round. And they were hilarious, and they came up with sitcoms and different things and talked about jokes and whatever it is. But Laurel and Hardy were the famous comedians in the 1920s and made a lot of money at shows. Okay, tomorrow, here's kind of how it's going to work. Tomorrow we're going to talk about heroes in the 20s, then we're going to get into the Great Depression, And we'll probably figure out when we're gonna have we're just gonna have a quiz on this. We're not gonna have a test. We're just gonna have a quiz on this particular topic. And it'll probably happen maybe before we leave to see how far it goes. Okay?
I've heard of tennis color. That's the only one.